start, Veena.
Namaste from India. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. To all of those participating today, thank you for tuning in, and for those who are here in the audience. My name is Veena Reddy. I am the United States Agency for International Development's Mission Director to India and Bhutan. This two-year term of Cdri, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, is co-led by the United States and India as the permanent co-chair. And in that capacity, we are led by, at the Governing Council level, by Dr. P.K. Mishra, advisor to the Prime Minister, and Ms. Samantha Power, the Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. And both Kamal Kishore and I are here today as co-chairs of the Executive Committee. Kamal is a member of the National Disaster Management Authority of India, and as I mentioned, co-chair of the Executive Committee of Cdri. We're also honored to have with us His Excellency Ugo Astuto, Ambassador to India from the European Union, another staunch supporter of Cdri, and we'll hear from him a little later in this session. And over the next few days, this conference is bringing together key decision makers, practitioners, and communities across the globe to discuss challenges, collaborate and find solutions, and have a call to action on sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And I'm looking forward to hearing messages from a number of distinguished speakers today on how we can tackle this complex issue. And we look forward to also hearing from you all as we will be conducting some live polls. So with that and this energizing spirit, I kick it over to Mr. Kamal Kishore.
Thank you very much, Veena. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined us. Sorry for this slight delay because of some connectivity issues with some of our online participation. This morning, this session is the one which sets the stage for what we are going to discuss for the next 3 days. There are two principal themes that run through this conference, the 4th edition of the International Conference on Disaster and Infrastructure. The first is, how do we manage transitions, multiple transitions that are taking place in the infrastructure systems? Traditional power systems, for example, are moving towards renewable systems. Likewise, the transport infrastructure is transitioning very rapidly and so on. How do we make sure that all of this transition happens in a manner that it can withstand climate and disaster shocks now and into the future? And the second theme is, how do we turn the whole conversation around and make it about people? Those of you who attended the inaugural ceremony, from all the 4 heads of government who spoke, one thing was very clear, and to quote our Prime Minister of India, he said that infrastructure is not about numbers. It is not about return on investment somewhere 20 years into the future. It is about people. We have to be able to ensure that whatever we invest in infrastructure is about providing services to people. So how do we turn the conversation around and make it about people rather than only the capital assets? To have this conversation and to set the stage for the remaining 3 days, we have an exciting lineup of speakers today, speakers and discussants this morning, this afternoon, this evening. We will have 2 messages. We will have a message from the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, His Excellency Mr. Franz Timmermans, followed by a message from Deputy Administrator Isobel Coleman from USAID. After that, we will have a panel discussion between the Minister of Environment from the Arab Republic of Egypt and Madam Mami Mizutori. She is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. We will have some expert comments from one of the lead coordinating authors for the IPCC report on vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience, Mr. Arumar Revi. We are very fortunate today to be joined by Ambassador His Excellency Hugo Sturzo, Ambassador of EU Delegation to India and Bhutan. He will give some closing remarks. With that, may I now invite all of you to hear what His Excellency Mr. Franz Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, has to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, around 3.6 billion people are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And if we let global temperature rise reach 1.5 degrees or beyond, it will cause unavoidable increases in multiple climate hazards. We desperately need decisive action. We need to continue our work to mitigate the climate crisis so that we still avoid the worst consequences. And we need to step up our adaptation efforts to prepare for what is already unavoidable. With the European Green Deal, the EU is working to cut net emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and be climate neutral by 2050. The legislation to deliver these targets is on the table, and we hope to have it adopted later this year. Outside the EU, we're offering various means of support to our partner countries for their green transitions. In 2020 alone, the EU and its member states committed more than 23 billion euros in climate finance. We are consistently calling on other donors to follow suit. Looking ahead, for the period between 2021 and 2027, 28 billion euros of the central EU budget will be allocated to climate action objectives in our partner countries. But the scale of the challenge requires further action. The EU is ready to accompany its partners in their recovery efforts in a socially, environmentally, and financially sustainable way. That is what Global Gateway is all about. It's our new framework for international partnerships and investments. By 2027, we aim to mobilize 300 billion euros. Its design enables us to scale up previous commitments and better meet the needs of local communities. The Gateway will help to deliver much-needed hard infrastructure and provide softer assistance to help attract sustainable investment. As such, Global Gateway will enable the EU and its partners to channel investments where infrastructure gaps have been exposed or exacerbated. Similarly, at the launch of the Africa-EU Global Gateway investment package this February, the EU put forward a number of initiatives. One of these is the Africa-EU Climate Resilience Initiative. It will support disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, enhance disaster preparedness. It will also contribute to recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction efforts, while strengthening governance to manage disaster risk. Let's also remember that investing in nature-based infrastructures, like strategically planned and managed networks of natural lands, water, and soil, can provide cost-effective and resilient complements to existing infrastructure. Such nature-based solutions help us adapt to climate change, but also give nature space to flourish again. The EU will therefore continue to support initiatives like the Great Green Wall, launched by the African Union to restore the continent's landscapes. Ladies and gentlemen, the examples I provided just now underline that we need strong partnerships to address the climate crisis with infrastructure that is clean, resilient, and consistent with a net zero future. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is a key partnership in this regard. For many partner countries, disaster resilience is already an existential and fundamental issue. I want to commend the Coalition for having created the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States facility, and I'm pleased to announce that the EU will contribute 5 million euros to this facility. We very much welcome the possibility to work with India and the Coalition. Disaster risk resilience is a common challenge for all South Asian countries, and you're key promoters in the region to enhance disaster recovery plans. Digitalization can also provide an important contribution to the fight against the climate crisis. Copernicus, the EU's Earth observation program, can offer valuable insights to our partners to improve resilience to natural hazards, as it has done through our hub in the Philippines. Initiatives such as this one go hand in hand with the EU's humanitarian assistance. Through our humanitarian aid, the EU allocates 76 million euros each year for disaster preparedness. It provides support for training for search and rescue, establishing early warning systems, developing contingency plans, and stockpiling equipment and supplies. Each of these actions play an important role in building the resilience of communities. Later this year, the international community will meet in Kunming for the Biodiversity COP15 and in Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27. We need to be ambitious. After all, the fight against the climate and biodiversity crises is a fight for our survival and for our common future. Each and every country is already affected, and some of us are literally fighting for their survival. Strengthening the disaster and climate resilience of the most vulnerable is, therefore, of the utmost importance. So, I wish you productive discussions over the coming days, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for sending us this message. Several very important takeaways from the remarks you made. I will not go through everything, but three big things that stand out to me. One is the EU's commitment to increasing global climate finance. You talked about this initiative on Global Gateway, which is providing a new framework for increasing investment in increasing climate finance. The second, your emphasis on nature-based solutions and how nature-based solutions have to be looked at in an integrated way with other investments in infrastructure. There was a quotable quote in your remarks that, it's not only about getting services from nature-based solutions, but also giving nature a space to breathe and space to flourish. So I think it's really important, and very happy to say that this topic is adequately addressed in the program of this conference. And finally, I think the point you made about Copernicus and similar capacities within the EU, I would almost call it excess technical capacity, which is not just useful for the EU member states, but also for the world as a whole. And really looking forward to continued EU support. Thank you very much for your contribution to IRIS, and we really have to build on this partnership and deliver results for people who are most vulnerable to disaster and climate risks. With that, now let me invite Deputy Administrator of USAID, Madam Isobel Coleman, to deliver a keynote address.
Thank you, Kamal, for the introduction and for your leadership of this important coalition. What we're here to discuss, and what this audience understands better than most, is that if we do not act today to fight the climate crisis, any progress we make on the remaining challenges will evaporate. Just last month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their latest report, showing that greenhouse gas emissions were higher in the last decade than in any previous decade. And we're already seeing a glimpse of what this could mean. Here in the United States, we're experiencing record-breaking temperatures and droughts that bring forest fires out of natural landscapes into communities where houses, schools, and businesses are reduced to ashes. Stronger, more frequent storms are taking their toll on roads, bridges, electric grids, and power lines, causing billions of dollars worth of damage. Yet despite what we see and experience in America, we know that the countries least responsible for producing the emissions that fuel this crisis are facing the most dire consequences. Right now, across the Horn of Africa, over 15 million people are in need of immediate food assistance, resulting from the region's fourth consecutive year of drought. Catastrophe looms as communities in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia await rainfall to grow their crops and feed their livestock. Each year, the lands and people of the small island developing states, countries like Kiribati, Fiji, and the Marshall Islands, are routinely and existentially threatened by high tides, typhoons, and tropical cyclones. The reality is, here in the United States and around the world, climate change is threatening poor and vulnerable populations today. It is up to us to marshal the resources needed to help them adapt and become resilient to the mounting shocks and stressors. That's the genesis of this coalition, spearheaded by the government of India, joined by the United States as a founding member, and made up of 29 countries, 5 leading multilateral organizations, and the private sector associations representing over 400 companies. Thanks to the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, India co-chair and principal secretary to the Prime Minister, Dr. P.K. Mishra, COP26 president and formerly this coalition's governing council chair, the Honorable Alok Sharma, and all of the coalition's members and stakeholders from both public and private sectors. We have this forum to coordinate our efforts and share the strategic and technological solutions that can address the specific resilience need of communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. For the United States' contribution, USAID intends to broaden the coalition's impact by extending and diversifying its membership to new country partners, galvanizing the private sector to invest more of its resources and technical expertise, and helping partner countries to align their goals and commitments across the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. Already, USAID is helping advance CDRI priorities. In India, we're contributing to the government's goal of constructing 30 million green, energy-efficient, affordable homes in rural and urban areas. We partnered with the government of Ghana to develop an improved integrated resource plan and an integrated power system to help Ghanaians anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to future challenges and build the power sector's resilience and mitigate electricity disruptions. And in Peru, as climate change and human activity disrupt the flow of the Andean rivers, USAID works with communities in the wetlands around Lima to restore natural ecosystems and mitigate water scarcity and climate risk through sustainable management of landscapes that purify and store water, reduce stormwater runoff, and minimize flood damage. President Biden has made resilience to climate-driven disasters one of his top priorities. To complement this coalition's work, the Biden administration's global infrastructure and prepare initiatives seek to commit and mobilize trillions of dollars in the coming decades to support disaster-resilient infrastructure and climate change adaptation in low and middle-income countries around the world. And we're committed to prioritizing the gender impacts of adaptation, resilience, and infrastructure, and disaster recovery efforts, because while the climate crisis affects all people, the evidence also shows that women and girls bear a disproportionate burden of its worst impacts. All of us gathered here rightly acknowledge that the global problems we face today require global cooperation and solutions. The impact of the climate crisis will only continue to grow in dollars and in lives if we do not step up our commitments and broaden the scope and impact of this coalition. The good news is that investments help communities adapt and build resilience to climate change. And it's not just the right thing to do, but the smart thing. Every dollar we invest in adaptation and resilience saves us $3 in humanitarian assistance when disaster strikes. And as other countries and institutions come forward, the U.S. will continue to mobilize resources, institutional know-how, and technical expertise to help. I want to thank you all for showing up and joining this incredibly important coalition of partners. It's my hope that this is just a start, and that through continued exchanges we can better support the people hardest hit by extreme weather events and help make their communities more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Coleman. Thank you for reminding us that the toll of disasters falls on all of us. All countries face it, but not everybody experiences it equally. And it differs by country, differs by population, gender, income levels. All of these point to vulnerabilities that we must address through a people-centric approach. and also emphasizing how we can work through coalitions like Cdri to coordinate, to share data, to find solutions collectively, and also for outlining some of the goals of the U.S. participation and the leadership level, including diversifying the membership of Cdri, increasing our engagement with the private sector so that they are together in this issue, and also increasing resilience throughout the world. Thank you. Kamal?
Thank you very much, Veena, and I will also echo the same thoughts, very insightful, very provocative remarks from Ambassador Coleman, the involvement of private sector, the fact that USAID is involved in a number of CDRI countries, India, Ghana, Peru, for example. There are opportunities for converging our efforts, focusing again, on women and girls, again, echoing the people-centric theme of this conference. So before we go further, we would like to have just one poll question for all our participants who are joining online. And the simple poll question is, in your view, which sector will undergo the most disruptive transition in infrastructure by 2050? Power, transport, digital and telecom, or health? There is no correct answer here. It's what is your perception of which of these sectors, power, transport, digital and telecom and health, will go the biggest disruptions in the coming 30 years or so? So those of us who are here physically present in the studio, maybe we can just do a show of hands, if you don't want to download the application. So how many people think power is the top? No one thinks the power is the top sector which will be disrupted? Transport? Oh, so many hands go up. Digital and telecom? You are from the telecom sector, that's why. Health? Oh, that is surprising. So I guess, I didn't count the hands, but in the studio here, health
followed by transport.
Health followed by?
Transport.
Health followed by transport, followed by power. It's completely counterintuitive for me, because I would think that power would undergo most transition, and that's where we need to focus. So that's, we will soon get the results of the online poll as well, but we don't need to wait for that. We'll come back to it. Maybe we can proceed with our discussion among the discussants. So maybe I can open it to you before the questions, maybe, Veena?
Sure. I'll introduce the next speaker.
Yes.
So I'm now inviting Ms. Mami Mizutori, Assistant Secretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction at the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, to share her insights on the 2022 Global Assessment Report on Disaster Reduction. Thank you. Excited to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning from Geneva, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's truly a great pleasure to participate once again in this year's International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Having co-hosted with the Government of India in 2019, one of the original international workshops on disaster resilient infrastructure, we, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, we are proud to see how the workshop has grown into a big global conference, and of course, how the coalition itself has grown from a concept to a global movement partnership. And with special thanks to contributors and advisors such as Mr. Kamal Kishore and Mr. Armar Revi, last week in New York, we launched the 2022 Global Assessment Report for Disaster Risk Reduction, otherwise known as GA 2022. This is our flagship report on the state of risk and what we have to do about it. This year's report is all about risk governance, calling for drastic changes on how countries govern and act on risk, and it's a theme that resonates closely with this political forum. GA 2022 predicts that by 2030, the world will face around 560 medium to large-scale disasters per year. Now that is 1.5 disasters a day. These disasters will not only kill, displace people every day, but they will drain national budgets, international cooperation, and erode all sustainable development gains. The cost of disasters has more than doubled over the past 3 decades to an average of 170 billion a year. And we heard about how disasters affect many of us and all of us, like in the case of pandemic, but differently. So currently, 18 of the 20 countries with the highest disaster risk are middle and lower income countries, which means that every disaster is pushing the most vulnerable people further deep into poverty. This is the challenge that we face and which GA 2022 talks about. This trend of growing disaster risks makes the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure a crucial mechanism to reducing disaster impact and protecting development. Sustainable, resilient infrastructure provides people in their communities and the environment with their first line of defense against shocks and stressors, and they are critical for quick recovery from disasters as well. In addition, resilient infrastructure can accelerate both local and national economic growth, and that's why reducing damage to critical infrastructure and disruption to basic services is a key global target, one of the 7 global targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and it's also an enabler for achieving the SDGs. But designing, investing, and building infrastructure resilience is lagging behind the rapid increase of disaster risks. And if we are to reduce the growing risk from climate change, we must fulfill the call made at COP26 of increasing investment in climate and disaster resilient infrastructure, gray, green, and blue, all of them. This includes providing technical and financial assistance to the least developed countries and the small island developing states. In this effort, we need to pay attention to those most in need to make sure that infrastructure and services are built and managed in an accessible and equitable way for all. This is the people-centered approach. And through a people-centered approach developing resilient infrastructure, we can capture the changing nature of risk and the changing needs and demands of the communities. This approach calls for looking beyond the physical condition of infrastructure to considering the quality and continuity of the services it provides. Only when risk governance is inclusive, with the voice of communities heard, we can significantly reduce the impacts of disasters on people and environment. We can protect livelihoods and ensure the continuity of basic services. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, which is closely aligned to what GA 2022 is portraying. And I hope that the outcome of this year's conference will include commitments for action by all stakeholders to embed resilience in infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Misatori. Your emphasis on risk governance is very well taken, and wow, 1.5 disasters a day. That echoes some of the comments we heard earlier today, such as from the leader of Madagascar, of multiple 4 tornadoes in 25 days. this is, as you quite rightly pointed, pushing people further and further into poverty and eroding many of the gains we've made in the past decades. And also your emphasis on paying attention to those most in need is truly inspiring and very in line with the theme of this conference on people-centric approach to disaster resilience. And this report will provide strategic policy guidance on disaster risk reduction to countries and the international community in alignment with the goals of Cdri. So I'm looking forward to hearing more, and I'll take it to Kamal to lead us off with questions and polls.
Thank you very much, SRSG, for those remarks, inspiring as well as challenging us at the same time. You talked about the need for making risk governance inclusive and people-centric. I think that's the crux of it all. Your point about not just the number of disasters, but also the scale of disasters is really something we should pay attention to. It's not numbers are increasing, but each individual disaster in its impact is also becoming more severe. And you alluded to, from time to time, about the Global Assessment Report of 2022, which was launched just last week. Very important report. It is a report which is a seminal publication started by UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction in 2007. Every 2 years, it provides a risk update of what's happening in the world and focuses global attention on risk reduction issues, risks emanating from both hydrometeorological hazards, but also geophysical hazards and so on. So, and in the last, since 2019, under your leadership, the reports have begun to focus on systems resilience. And you've been exhorting governments to take action on addressing systems resilience and not just look at discrete assets. So maybe if I could ask you, what are some of the 2 or 3 action areas? You know, your remarks, you closed by saying that, you know, it's time for action. You know, we can talk, but actually we have to act. So what are 2 or 3 big action areas for building disaster resilience emanating from the Global Assessment Report?
Well, thank you very much, Kamal, for that question. So indeed, GAR 2022 doesn't stop as talking about the challenges, because that we already know, don't we, that we have a tremendous challenge in front of us. It has a call to action of 3 highlights, I would say. And the first one is we need to measure what we value. Now, what does it mean? It means that we're actually, when we talk about risk governance currently, we are not truly measuring what we value in terms of people, planet, and prosperity. We put too much emphasis on what can be measured by GDP. Let's say, what are the gains, what are the losses? And we're not really accounting for the true costs, because we're not counting actually how much disaster risk, when they actually become disaster, is eroding our planet in terms of the environment. It's not talking about how much disasters are eroding people's livelihoods, not in terms of only their jobs lost, but more in a societal way. So the first action is we need to start measuring what we value and account for the true cost of disaster risk. This is the first one. The second call for action is that we need to design systems to factor in how our human minds make decisions about risk.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we make decisions about risk? Unfortunately, many times we make decisions based on short-termism. And when we think about potential disaster risk, we're thinking that they're somewhat far away geographically, somewhat in the future, time-wise. Mm-hmm. And we're also not good at imagining what are the new risks, the systemic risks that are surrounding us. We tend to base our behavior and our thinking on what we have experienced. Now, this is important, of course, learning from your experience, But unfortunately, we are living in a world where the systemic risk is bringing uncertainty to our lives, our planet. And so we need to not only base our decisions, and when we say we, it's about the individuals, but also governments, also policymakers, private companies. We need to understand how the human mind works and allow that we can make decisions based on the reality that we are facing. The third action, call to action, is we need to reconfigure governance and financial systems to work across silos and design in consultation not only for but with affected people. What does it mean? As Kamal just mentioned, we are now living in a world where we are surrounded, unfortunately, by systemic risk. One risk leads to another. COVID-19 has showed this to us. It started as a public health crisis, very quickly turned into a full-blown economic and societal risk crisis. So this is what we are living through. So we can't design our risk governance towards one single risk at a time. We need to look at the systemic risk. We need to understand that we're living in uncertainty. And for that, we need to break down all the silos that we have in our structures, whether it's in the government, whether it's in private companies, so that we can work across it. And importantly, we do need to listen to the people who are most affected. We talk a lot about the vulnerable people, but do we actually listen to them? Do we actually understand what their needs are in terms of this governance? Their voices need to be incorporated into the planning of risk governance and the implementation. And only when you can do that and adopt a system which is not only top down, but also bottom up, and when top down and bottom up meets, then we have a risk governance that can truly be beneficial for everybody. So these are the call to action that GAR 2022 has. And I really would hope that we have a very short edition, which is a summary for policymakers of the GAR 2022. So hope that many people can read that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, SRSG. We will certainly provide a link to the policymakers' summary of the GAR. Very important action areas identified by GAR. I think this whole thing of looking at how we change essentially our risk behavior and go beyond short-termism to looking at long-term, imagine risk scenarios of which risks that may be difficult to model, but we need to look at it system-wide. And finally, your exhortation for basically leaving behind or shedding bad habits of working in silos and working across and looking at people not as our objects of interventions, but principal actors, which means that we work with them, governance systems work with them rather than only for them. So I think that's very, very, that really sets the tone, very much aligned with also what we want to discuss here over the next 3 days. At this point, let me bring in Aruma Ravi. He is the director of Indian Institute of Human Settlements in Bangalore, India. He is also leading, he has been leading the discourse on both disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation for over 3 decades. Now, 2 months ago, the IPCC report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability was released, and he is one of the principal authors. From a climate side, it is sort of a complement to what GAR does. The Global Assessment Report looks at all hazards. The IPCC work focuses on climate hazards only. So, Arumar, you've heard the messages from the EU Executive Vice President, you've heard USAID Deputy Administrator, and you've just heard remarks from SRSG. So any reflections on what are some of the key actions that CDRI member countries need to prioritize to ensure resilience of rapidly transitioning infrastructure systems?
Thanks, Kamal. I had the opportunity of being present when the SRSG and the DSG launched the GAR report last week in New York. So I think this is really an interesting opportunity where we're able to bring together, three different things. One is the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, and we just heard SRSG mention that, because that's at the heart of this process, especially if we are looking at people-centered kind of transitions. And we often forget that, and COVID has really taught us that when we forget that, then I think it doesn't matter whether you're a rich or a poor country, you will be in some trouble if you really don't build from bottom up. And I think that's been the basis of most community-based processes, and that's what Sendai in some senses is built around. So the first thing that I'd like to say is that, climate is a subset of the larger sort of risk framing. But in the climate space, we have identified, just like we heard just now around the GAR, that we really need rapid transitions of systems, because systemic risk in a world with 8 billion people with tremendous interconnections is really becoming the most significant challenge we're seeing. And it's not only systemic risk as we've seen in COVID, it's also what we call compounding and cascading risk. So a number of things happen at the same time. And, especially in small island states, even India has, over the last couple of years, seen things that we've never imagined before. We're seeing cyclonic storms running off both on the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea at the same time. So sort of interaction as far as that's concerned. And then, things moving from one sector to the other. So in that, from the climate perspective, we've identified, 5 major system transitions that are necessary to effect, I would say, in the next 15 or 20 years, if we are to have any hope of being able to contain sort of overshoot, or at least keep warming below 2 degrees or certainly closer to 1.5. And the critical ones, which are important for CDRI countries, are of course the energy transition. That's why I was a little surprised when people didn't list energy as the most important one, because power is absolutely central to that process. Electrification and building resilient power systems is important not only in more developed and more well-endowed countries, but in countries of the global south, especially those in which energy poverty is very important. So if you can't have climate resilient development unless you're able to address questions of poverty. So I would say that's going to be the most significant transition that we see in the near future as we move away from fossil fuels into other renewables. That will create its own challenges, because these are decentralized systems for which we don't have governance frameworks. In fact, technical frameworks that will become difficult to deal with. The second thing which is related to that, and that will be driven by climate impacts, is dealing with water infrastructures. Fine. So there's the energy transition, and then there's the sort of what we call the urban and the infrastructure transition. And in that, I would say water is probably the most critical thing, because what we're going to see with climate is more droughts, more flooding, too much and too little water at the same time in places that are not designed for it. And of course, in time, the impact of sea level rise and large storms. So that's going to be another very critical thing. I think our water infrastructures in many parts of the world are not fit for purpose. They're not designed for the kind of challenges we're talking about. And as Mami talked about, we have two 1.5s here. There's a 1.5 degrees Celsius target in some senses, and there's a 1.5 events per day kind of thing that will come from the kind of processes there. So we need to sort of address those simultaneously. And in that, I would say one thing that we've often neglected is looking at ecosystem-based adaptation, or what some people call nature-based solutions, to be able to make sure that we have the security as far as water is concerned. And because water is connected to life, it's connected to food security. And food security is very fragile at the current point of time. It means connecting in other parts of the economy particularly. So I would say these two infrastructures are very critical, and you can't actually run these infrastructures effectively unless the mobility systems enable them to bring things together, especially in a world that's increasingly urban. So mobility infrastructures, whether it's for logistics, which is shipping, rail transport, road transport, etc., but also, of course, inside urban areas. So these are going to be the big shifts that are taking place. But as we decarbonize these new infrastructures, especially for transportation, we're going to have a new set of sort of opportunity in some senses, but also a transformation of these systems, which will involve both the private sector and extensive regulation from the public sector. So when you bring this all together, at least from the climate point of view, we call that climate resilient development. So it's making adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development happen at the same time. But the difference, I think, when you start bringing disaster risk reduction and climate together is other risks that are not climatological, that are seismotectonic, that are technical in some senses. We've seen that cascade that happened in Fukushima, for example, which is really a great example for us. But there's something else which may be useful to touch on, and that is many of our imaginations are focused around large and significant events, what we call in the global assessment of risk as sort of intensive risk. But in the everyday life of billions of people, intensive risk is going to actually sort of expand. The everyday risk that we see of not having water, of having health risks as far as that's concerned, of for food security questions, etc., or even having access to safe buildings and continuous services. I think we need to provide a little bit more attention to this, because the long tail of that distribution, especially in many of the CDRI member countries, is going to be important. And if we don't take that into account now, we will be building infrastructures that are designed for large enterprises, large cities, large people, more economically developed places and people, and forgetting the bulk of our population, who are the most vulnerable. Because risk reduction in some senses is going to be critically dependent on vulnerability reduction. And for that, I think we really need to look at the long tail, looking at everyday risk. And that's where I think disaster risk, climate risk, and development can actually come together. And for that, of course, the critical question, as we know, is altering the risk governance framework, whether it's for climate or whatever, or other risks, and integrating that into the everyday process of planning, of development investment, and the implementation of public programs and the regulation of private activities. That's, I think, the most significant challenge. We have lots of issues there in most countries, but we have lots of interesting examples that we can learn from. And then finally, getting the financing right. Because if the financing is not right and we're not able to get the resources into the places that need them, whether it's for the new infrastructure, it's for the retrofit of existing infrastructures, and this is not only true for countries that are developing. Europe and North America, and I would imagine Japan also, have serious challenges in this space. So being able to get the resources in to do the right things are going to be quite challenging. And for that, we need strong institutions. And of course, none of this will work unless individuals, communities, and firms are able to step up and do this, because this is something that's already cascading, as we've learned through COVID, through our entire system. So the societal response is going to be very important. And this is something that both in the GAR and in the IPCC reports, we define this as what we call the societal transition. We have to deal with the demand side. We have to deal with trying to understand how people think and perceive risk and how they integrate it into their decision making. Most of them are very rational in their own context. But if the context involves systemic risks, which people don't have control of because it comes from somewhere else, or it involves other processes which they don't have control of, then you get a whole range of irrational and sometimes complex behaviors which we don't really want to deal with, like we've seen in COVID. So this is a great opportunity for us to take this thing forward. I think as CDRI builds out its own portfolio, we have the Global Infrastructure Risk report coming out and actions taking place in various places. We will start learning by doing in very different contexts. So thank you for the opportunity. I think this is a very exciting conversation we're going to have over the next 2 or 3 days. And it's wonderful to see many old colleagues and members coming together in this.
Thank you very much, Arumar. Please stick around for another 10-15 minutes if you can. I have a follow-up question to ask you about what does it mean for risk governance in new energy systems which are more decentralized. The accountability frameworks will be different. But before that, let me go back to SRSG. SRSG, it would be appropriate to say that UNDRR, in your leadership over the last several years, has really brought to fore the notion of systemic risk. In 2019 and 2022 global assessment report. So the sort of the discourse on systemic risk is no longer an esoteric discourse. It's right in front of us. No one can ignore it. Everybody's talking about it. But when it comes to interdependencies in the global system, integration across sectors, how do you see, what is the way forward in terms of understanding those interdependencies, perhaps, and also managing them in a way that each interdependent, wherever there is interdependency, we also look at how we build resilient systems. So some thoughts emanating from UNDRR, from the World Global Assessment Report on cascading risks and so on.
Well, thank you, Kamal, for that important question. And if I try to answer your question in the context of infrastructure that we'll be talking about in the coming 3 days. So yes, indeed, we are living in a deeply interconnected world, interconnected risk, interconnected system. And at the same time, we are heavily dependent on the services that these integrated, interconnected infrastructure provides. Now, this can provide us both with advantages and disadvantages because on one hand, yes, we can create smart cities with interconnected and more sustainable infrastructure systems by linking industries to form circular economies that are more efficient with limited negative impact on the environment. But on the other hand, this interconnectedness can introduce challenges and threats that we have been talking about this morning, and we do not yet fully understand or are prepared for what these challenges and threats are. For example, in 2017, cyber attacks disrupted critical infrastructure across Europe, the National Health Service, NHS in the UK, telecommunications in Spain, railway operations in Germany, and shipping operations in Denmark. And what this tells us that policy, strategies, and regulatory frameworks, they need to be based on an improved understanding of the vulnerabilities of interconnected national infrastructure systems to different risks, which are multiple, compounding, and complex. And in answering your question, I would like to emphasize that first and foremost, we do need to understand, as you say, the state and performance of our existing infrastructure better and strengthen our risk governance. Now, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction has 7 global targets, and one of them is to reduce the loss to the damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. In a word, let's make our infrastructure more resilient so that services is not disrupted. But unfortunately, or should I say, well, the fact is, there still isn't yet in the Sendai framework or related documents a clear understanding of what exactly is resilient infrastructure. And if we don't understand what is resilient infrastructure, then it's very difficult to have a benchmark and say, okay, this is what we need to do, and make sure that any intervention that we make related to the infrastructure sector is not eroding the gains until this time. So in order to bridge this gap at UNDRR, in consultation with member states and many other stakeholders, we are developing a set of principles for resilient infrastructure. These are 6 principles, and some of them we've already been talking about. So first, we need to adaptively transform. We need to make infrastructure environmentally integrated. Third, they need to be protected by design. Fourth, they need to be socially engaged. Fifth, they need to be shared responsibility for the resilience of infrastructure. And finally, 6, we need to be learning continuously. These are 6 principles which are interconnected themselves, because when the risks are interconnected, the governance has also to need to be interconnected. Each 6 principle has a set of key actions And the aim is to provide, as I mentioned, a global benchmark and global understanding on which to base the resilience of infrastructure. And in addition to these 6 principles, to go one step further, we are also introducing a concept that we have coined net resilience gain. Now, what is net resilience gain? Net resilience gain is to make sure that every intervention around infrastructure is leaving critical services in a better state compared to the current baseline. This is what we call net resilience gain. And in order to reflect this baseline, the 6 principles, and also the net resilience gain concept, in order to make this from a concept into reality, what we have started to do at UNDRR is to support countries to stress test the resilience of their current infrastructure that could be affected by multiple stressors, including, of course, climate change. We hope that these 6 principles, once they are launched at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction this month in Bali, Indonesia, that they will be adopted by many governments as possible, so that we can have a shared understanding of what is resilient infrastructure. And I hope that this work can contribute to what Cdri is pushing forward. Thank you, Kamal.
Thank you very much, SRSG. That is indeed a very important piece of normative work, and having engaged with that process, I can also say that the 6 principles look at not just the physical resilience of infrastructure systems, but also effective governance systems that underpin them. So thank you very much for that, and this is something indeed I'm sure even CDRI member countries would like to use as a frame for driving action at the national and subnational level. Coming back to you, Arumar, you talked about the fact that as energy transition happens, there are decentralized systems of energy production, transmission, distribution. It will throw new challenges in terms of risk governance. You talked about ecosystem-based adaptation, which is also called nature-based solutions these days. We're talking about ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions, but at the same time, you have different sets of governance actors managing ecosystems, and a completely different set of actors building or managing infrastructure. How do we bring them together to work together, think together, govern together, assess risk together, and build resilience together?
That's a very big challenge, Kamal. So let me just pick up on a few things. If you're looking at the resilience of energy systems, I would say maybe slightly contrarian here, that the biggest risk to energy systems, especially in the developing world, is actually energy poverty. We don't think of it that way. But if people don't have universal access, if they're not able to deliver on SDG 7, then we have a deep challenge, because then there'll be all kinds of other things, because people have to survive of using biomass, a whole range of other sources, and we'll be locked into other ways of doing that. And this is something, at least what I privately consider one of the gaps in what we do in Paris. That's the first thing that's there. So if you want to sort of build resilient systems, you have to provide universal access to energy systems, because it connects with a range of things. It connects with food security, because if you don't have energy, you can't pump water, because pumping water is quite important in some senses for agriculture. You can't sort of work on SG2. You just, similarly, as far as clean water and sanitation is concerned, if water access is limited, you can't manage to do that, etc. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, we need to try and promote electrification of systems as much as possible. And this is not an easy task. Many parts of the world have high levels of electrification, but if you're not able to take electrification into the household, into the enterprise, and essentially move away as much as possible from other forms of energy, and you can't do that completely, because many industrial systems will still require other forms of energy, and that's why the big debate about hydrogen, etc., is going to be kind of important in that process as an energy carrier. But electrification is going to be very important for most systems. So making sure that that's stable and organized, especially in many parts of of sub-Saharan Africa, still many parts of Asia, etc., is going to be important. You cannot do energy efficiency, you can't do good demand-side management on energy systems unless you have quality power. Otherwise, the systems don't work in some senses. The third thing, obviously, is to decarbonize the grid. At the moment, our grid in many parts of the world is organized around fossil fuels that are available in concentrations in particular places through thermal power plants, in some cases with hydro and other renewables. But that grid has to fundamentally shift. There's a big push, for example, for electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are a good idea. Locally, they help with air pollution, etc. But electric vehicles don't work very well if the grid is dirty, because effectively, in terms of resilience of that grid, in terms of trying to get to net zero, you're still in some trouble. So the grid the cleaning up and decarbonizing the grid is going to be a very difficult challenge, because the circumstances differ from country to country in terms of what's available, what is secure in terms of energy, especially in a world that is sort of interrupted by conflict. That's, as we can see just now with oil prices where they are, we're in a kind of difficult situation. The challenge with many of these new decentralized systems, whether it's solar PV or wind, etc., is that they need storage. And that has its own challenges in terms of the supply chain to create storage. And I don't think we're thinking ahead enough about how these storages will be maintained, both in the grid and otherwise. This is a kind of a new frontier in some senses that we have to breach. Prices are coming down for solid state storage quite dramatically, but you can't run an entire country on this in other places. So that's another big issue for us. So when we're talking about resilience, it's the grid, it's the storage systems, it is the sources, which will be much more decentralized, which is actually quite good, because then you can map supply and demand quite effectively. To talk to your question about sort of nature in some senses, I would say the agriculture sector is probably the most important sort of nexus where you can see that nexus between food, water, and energy, because irrespective of where we are, whether you're in North America, in Latin America, or Asia and Africa, we're increasingly using groundwater and water that comes from sources that are away from just rain-fed agriculture. That's sort of critical to productivity, it's critical to farm incomes, it's also critical to food security. So if energy systems are not resilient, we can immediately see that with mobile telephony and ICT systems going down, because that immediately impacts us. But I would imagine the most difficult challenge we're going to be seeing is in managing water security. And UNDRR just brought out a major report last year on drought. That nexus is going to be very, very critical. The challenge, of course, is that water and land are managed by completely different systems across the world with respect to energy systems. Energy systems are more engineered, harder infrastructures. They will now have to blend and work together with much more decentralized systems, which of course, in some cases may help resilience, because as you break down large centralized systems, you have more redundancy, you have opportunities to be able to use networks to build sort of network-based resilience. But the challenge here is very often of conceptualization. Land-based systems have been the way that nation states have been managed for years, for centuries, I would say. And they're not used to dealing with these kind of hard infrastructures. Similarly, the hard infrastructures like power systems are not used to dealing with the messiness of land and water systems and individual consumers, etc. And in between, of course, you have the private sector in many shapes and sizes, which is trying to fill the gap. So I think we need a lot of interesting experiments which will enable the integration of these kind of systems and building cross-sector resilience, which is not easy. In India, for example, we've had major initiatives of power sector reforms that have fallen apart because of the implications of changes in pricing and how they deal with food security and agrarian change. So these are complex questions. They require integration at a pretty high level. They also require change of mindsets and reorganization of institutional mandates, which are not easy and will take time. And I would say they will become, in some senses, the most significant challenges we'll face in the implementation of the resilient infrastructure kind of grid. You can do that with particular systems. When the interconnects don't work, then we will find some interesting challenges. So lots of opportunities for innovation. I think even the global north will learn from the global south in this, because there's a lot of innovation happening in this space in many parts of the global south. So I hope I gave you some sense of where this might go.
Thank you very much, Arumar. I think the way you started this segment of your remarks by highlighting that you can't talk about addressing energy poverty as separate from clean energy. So we have to talk about energy for all as an integral part of this entire discourse on energy transition. Your specific points on water, land, energy, different kinds of institutional cultures around managing or governing these systems, how do we bring them together if we have to address systemic risk is really important as well. But what is clear to me is that for a lot of this, we do not necessarily have a time-tested method. So we have to take risks and we have to actually experiment these things. And that's where also the value of the work Cdri intends to do comes in. It's not a south-south, north-south partnership. It's in all directions. The innovation can come from any part of the world, and we have to be open to picking that up and scaling it in places where those are needed. I am asked to do a summary of what has been said by SRSG and Arumar, and before that our two distinguished speakers from the European Union and USAID. But I will decline that responsibility and not do that because it's impossible to do it. It was a very rich conversation, lots of takeaways, which we will have the opportunity to deliberate on over the coming 3 days. I think it's a pity that the environment minister from Egypt, her connection kept going down, but I'm sure we'll try to find an opportunity later during the next 3 days to bring her into some session so that we can hear her as well. Egypt is going to host the next conference of parties in Sharm el-Sheikh later this year. And in Glasgow, the needle has really shifted more towards adaptation. Adaptation issues are getting much more airtime compared to even just 5 years ago. And I think that direction of travel is going to continue in Egypt. So it would be very important to hear from them what is the government of Egypt's vision, in which direction would they want to take it. We will definitely create an opportunity later during the 3 days to hear her thoughts on that. I would invite His Excellency to have the last word.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kamal. Thank you for inviting me. This was a fascinating discussion indeed, very instructive, and I think the perfect introduction to your discussion in the forthcoming 3 days. Well, if I have to pick one message emerging from what the eminent speaker said, I think I will pick and choose the call for action. It's a call for action, and it's in a number of dimensions. Mitigation. You have just referred to COP27. Indeed, unless we keep the global temperature rise below 1.5. We are not going to leave a planet fit for purpose to the next generation. So the focus obviously must remain also on adaptation and keep temperatures down. But the second dimension, and here let me recall that what we are trying to do in the European Union through the Green Deal is precisely a change of paradigm to be able to achieve growth through the protection of the environment and not at the expense of the environment. That's obviously a domestic endeavor, but it's also part and parcel of all our external action. And then adaptation, as you say. Mitigation and adaptation need to go hand in hand. As Vice President Timmermans said, some of the damage done is irreversible. And the global assessment report with the indication of 1.5 disasters a day is indeed a very sober presentation of what expects us. So we we in the European Union, we have launched another major policy initiative, the Global Gateway, which is about providing quality infrastructure, about partnering with the rest of the world for quality infrastructure. And by that, we need infrastructure which is sustainable. Sustainable in a fiscal sense, fiscally, in a social sense, but in an environmental aspect for sure. And as a number of speakers said, what we need is a global approach. We need global cooperation, because resilient infrastructure, I think one speaker said very eloquently, is the first line of defense. And particularly the changes brought by climate change particularly affect the most vulnerable sections of the population and of the world. So what we need to do, again, let me echo what one of the speakers said, is to increase investment in climate and infrastructure, targeting particularly those in need. And I'm particularly happy to say that the European Union is a member of the coalition. We are happy to be associated with your work to foster this transition of systems, which, as you said, is going to be crucial in a number of economic sectors and social activities. In electricity, the energy transition is clearly going to be crucial, but not exclusive. And let me close here by repeating what you said. It is not an exoteric discourse. It's a very immediate and practical need. So the need we need to act now, here and now, for the sake of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. With that, we close this session and we break for lunch, a short break of 30 minutes, and we will be back here in the same studio at 1:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.